Good morning. We're very glad you could join us for this webinar today about Scotland's deposit return scheme, a new recycling scheme for cans and bottles. Today we're going to focus in particular on Scotland's island communities. My name's Claire Monroe. I'm the communications lead for the scheme. This is my colleague Stuart Murray, who leads on our islands engagement work and our stakeholder work in general. Before we get started, a few important points for you to be aware of. During the webinar, you can get in touch with us anytime using the questions box on your screen. We're going to be live for about an hour today, but if we don't have time to get to your question, we'll be in touch with you directly afterwards using the email address that you gave us during the sign-up process. Also, if you have any comments at all that you'd like to send to us afterwards, you can get in touch with us using drsevents@zerowastescotland.org.uk. The link to this webinar will be live until the end of the session, so if you experience any connection problems or issues, just rejoin using the Livestorm link. Stuart's going to be talking us through a presentation with some information about the scheme, and that will be available after the session on our website, depositreturn.scot. So, first of all, just some information about Zero Waste Scotland for those of you who might not be familiar with us. We are a not-for-profit environmental organisation funded by the Scottish Government and the European Regional Development Fund. We provide leadership around responsible use of products and resources with a particular focus on where we can have the most impact in tackling climate change. We also have a lot of expertise on the circular economy. So, what are we going to do today? I'll just talk you through the agenda for this webinar. First of all, we'll give an introduction to the deposit return scheme and what it could mean for you. We'll then move on to talking about what some of the potential challenges and opportunities for the scheme might be for Scotland's islands. We'll then move on to the main part of today, which is Your Say, a question and answer session where you can give us your comments and you can put your questions to myself and Stuart. Stuart.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to talk a bit about our role on the project, kind of what deposit return schemes are, and then I'll touch upon the islands work that we've been doing. So Zero Waste Scotland is supporting the Scottish Government on the design of the scheme for Scotland. We have been consulting with hundreds of organisations from a vast array of sectors to understand what they would want a scheme to look like. We have visited a number of countries in Scandinavia and the Baltics in particular to see what works best on their schemes, and we've engaged a number of countries out with that area, so in America and Australia, where they also have schemes. So why are we having this scheme? First of all, climate change. There's a real opportunity in increasing recycling and getting more containers back for recycling and reducing our carbon impact. So the equivalent is around about the same as taking 85,000 cars off the road each year. So it's a huge opportunity for Scotland. Litter prevention is a very visible part of litter when you have bottles and cans at the side of the street or on beaches. This is a real opportunity to incentivise people to do the right thing with those bottles and cans and not litter them. By recycling more of these bottles and cans, we'll get more back for recycling, so we'll get a higher tonnage. We're currently recycling about half of all bottles and cans that are put onto the market, and deposit return schemes can get upwards of 90% of those containers. So there's a huge opportunity here for Scotland, not only in terms of quantity, but also the quality of that material. So getting it back in a cleaner way that allows to go into higher value end uses. This provides the opportunity for the economy, so getting the jobs and the value of that material in Scotland where it can be processed. Ultimately, we can also deliver on social and behaviour change, so getting people away from single-use containers and to do the right thing with the single-use containers that they use. So what is a deposit return scheme? So a deposit return scheme is very simple. When you buy a drink in a bottle or a can, you'll pay a small deposit on the price of that product, and when you take the container back for recycling, you'll get the deposit back. From a consumer's perspective, it's very simple. If we move on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit how it works from industry's perspective. So a deposit return scheme is a form of extended producer responsibility. So what that means is the obligation is on the producer to get their products back for recycling. The scheme is funded in three ways. There are unredeemed deposits, which help to fund the system, and in any scheme, there's always an element of unredeemed deposits, no matter how high performing it is. There's the value of the material that's brought back for recycling, which is sold on to reprocessors, and that helps to fund the scheme. And any offset between the costs of operating the scheme and those two incomes are made by a producer fee, which is charged on a per container basis to producers. Producers have a number of obligations in this scheme, and we'd expect they would set up this purple circle in the middle, which is the scheme administrator, to carry out those obligations on their behalf. So we'll go through this diagram, which can be downloaded from our website. I appreciate it's quite small in some areas, so you can download it and look at it later on offline. So we start with producers at the top middle. We have those producers putting, for argument's sake, a bottle of water onto the market. When they sell it onto the wholesaler, they'll charge the unit price of that product plus the deposit. They'll report into the scheme administrator that they have put that container onto the market, and they'll pay the deposit into the scheme administrator alongside the producer fee. When the wholesaler sells it to the retailer, they will also charge the deposit, so at this point they are cost neutral. The retailer selling their products onto consumers who will go away and consume the beverage and bring it back to the retailer for recycling. The retailers effectively act as the return points in a deposit return scheme, taking the containers back and collecting them on behalf of the scheme administrator. For doing this, they are paid a handling fee. Now, there's two ways in which retailers might take containers back. For small volumes, they may take it back over the counter manually. And for shops that are expecting to take back a higher number of containers, they may install what's called a reverse vending machine, which checks that the container has been part of the scheme and can have the deposit paid out. For doing this job on behalf of the scheme administrator, the retailers get a handling fee. That covers the cost of the machine, the cost of staff time, and any other products that are required to facilitate the return of these containers. Now, I said earlier, the scheme administrator effectively operates this flow, and they will operate a logistics service to get containers back from retailers free of charge. Those containers, if they're collected manually, will be taken back to a counting centre, which is effectively a large reverse vending machine, or they're collected through machines in the first place, and that material can be sold straight onto the end market. And that material then goes to be made into new bottles and cans. So what about the Scottish scheme? So we now have the draft regulations sitting before the Scottish Parliament. They were laid in September of this year. They say that the deposit for the Scottish scheme will be 20 pence. That is for all containers, or all drinks, single-use containers that are PET plastic, glass, and steel and aluminium cans. The ethos of the scheme is that it should be as easy to return a container for recycling as it is to buy it in the first place. So you'll see here a number of examples of return points. We have shops, restaurants, takeaways. They'll all be expected to act as return points. The one difference is for what we're calling on-site consumption. So if you have a premise where you wouldn't expect the containers to leave the site, such as a restaurant, they do not need to charge the deposit, and equally they do not need to act as a return point. But because they will pay the deposit in the supply chain, it would be within their interest to collect the containers back for the scheme administrator. As I've outlined already, there are a number of ways in which return points may operate. Small volumes will be over the counter. Slightly larger volumes could be through what's called a reverse vending machine, and they come in different sizes. And there'll also be a requirement in those who are delivering via online to offer a take-back service, again, maximising the accessibility of the scheme. All that material coming back is to increase recycling, and the target in the Scottish scheme will be 90% after the third year of operation. Here's a timeline just to show you kind of where the deposit return scheme has come from. I'm not going to go through this line by line. There's just a few parts that I'd like to draw your attention to. So back in 2009, we've got the Climate Change Scotland Act, which has the provision for a deposit return scheme within it. So we have the primary legislation, and the regs that are sitting before Parliament at this moment in time are secondary regulations. If we go back to September 2017, this is when the Scottish Government announced in the First Minister's Programme for Government that we would be having a scheme for Scotland. At this point, we started looking at what that scheme could look like for Scotland, and in June of 2018 presented 4 examples of the scheme for a public consultation. That public consultation got around 3,000 responses in total, and we actually had an event in each local authority area as part of that consultation. In February this year, we published the response to that consultation, and subsequently we've had the scheme announcement, and in September of this year, the draft regulations being laid before Parliament. They're open for comment until December the 10th of this year. If you Google Deposit Return Scheme Scotland, you'll be able to find how to respond to that consultation formally. So when that consultation closes in December of this year, there'll be some reporting and analysis of the responses and any amendments made to the regulations as necessary. And then we'll go through the publication and the laying of the final regulations before Parliament and ultimately a parliamentary vote. Before the scheme is implemented, there'll be a minimum of a year, and we're currently in discussions with industry as to what that implementation period looks like.
Thank you, Stuart, for that description of the scheme and how it's going to work. Can you tell us a bit more about what it will mean specifically for retailers and for return points? Absolutely.
So all retailers that are selling a product or products that are part of the scheme will have to act as a return point under the deposit return scheme. So they'll take back containers and pay out deposits to consumers. They'll keep these containers for collection by the scheme administrator. For doing this, they will receive a reasonable handling fee on a per container basis. And as I said, this will compensate them for such things as shop space and staff time. How they choose to do that is up to the retailer. The regulations don't stipulate the method that they take back the container, so that can be a reverse vending machine. Alternatively, it could be a manual collection.
Thank you for that about retailers. And what about drinks producers? How will the scheme affect them?
Just to go back to retailers for a second, they must also show that the deposit is part, the container, is part of the scheme. So it needs to be displayed that the deposit has been charged on that container. As I've said, there is the option for on-site sellers not to charge the deposit to the public and then only return the containers that have been consumed on-site.
Thanks, Stuart, for adding in a bit more about retailers. Apologies there for skipping on. I was going on to ask about drinks producers and how the scheme will affect them.
So drinks producers will need to register with SEPA to put products onto the market. The draft regulations set a target of capturing 90% of the items that they place in the market back for recycling by the end of the year 3. What we expect to happen is producers will appoint a scheme administrator to operate on their behalf and ultimately operate the scheme as we saw earlier in the earlier slide. The scheme administrator, therefore, will take on that responsibility on their behalf, and they will be the ones that will have the annual collection targets to get the 90% back for recycling.
Okay, so that was a bit on producers. Stuart, I mentioned earlier that you work on our stakeholder engagement and, specifically you've been involved in the islands work. Can you tell us a bit more about the islands impact assessment and the round?
So there are a number of documents that are supporting the regulations as they go through Parliament. We've got a full business case, which is currently being updated, and we have a business regulatory impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and equalities impact assessment. We've also got the Islands Impact Assessment, which we're here to talk about today. We published the screening assessment document in September of this year, and this basically looks at what considerations there are for island communities and if there are any unique impacts on islands as a result of the regulations. This identified that transport was one, so getting material off the islands. So we're going through this islands impact assessment process. We've had a number of physical events, so we've been out and about around islands. We've been in Shetland, Orkney, Lewis, Skye, Arran, Bute and Islay. And for those who haven't been able to make a physical event to feed in what they think the impacts could be and to workshop those, we're having this event today to get the input of people who weren't able to attend.
Great, thank you very much, Stuart. As I mentioned, Stuart's been a key part of the team, which has been organising the events and is working towards the island's impact assessment. And really this work is all about gathering feedback from people who live on Scotland's islands about this scheme. So there is an additional opportunity. You can also feed directly into the island's impact assessment by leaving us a comment during the webinar today, or by contacting us on the following email address: drsevents@zerowastescotland.org.uk by this Thursday, the 28th of November. So I think that just about covers the description of the scheme that we're going to do today. So now we're going to move on to looking at some of the questions that you've been submitting prior to today and also during the session. Just a reminder as well, you can continue to submit your questions through the questions box on your screen. So I'm going to move to some of the questions now that we've had sent in by people in advance of today. So Stuart, the first question: Zero Waste Scotland has already visited 7 Scottish islands, as you were saying, to hold events on deposit return. What have you learned so far?
So there were 2 key learnings from the events that we've had so far. The first is around transport, and we've had good discussions across the islands and what that could mean in terms of ferry capacities and moving material off the island, particularly in terms of when there's bad weather and what that could mean for cash flows. The second is around community empowerment. So the opportunity for communities to act as return points, appreciating that there might be peaks and troughs in terms of the number of containers that are on islands, thinking specifically about the tourist season. So opportunities for local communities to return containers that may or may not have been purchased on the island and to use that to their advantage.
Okay, so moving on to islands drinks producers, and we know that there are quite a few. Drinks producers will have new obligations under the scheme, and the islands are host to quite a number of breweries and distilleries. Is there anything they should be aware of that this will mean for them in practice?
So in terms of the scheme, based on the islands, I don't think there's any unique impact in what they have to do, but they will need to, as I outlined in my presentation, sign up with SEPA, register with SEPA that they are a producer of drinks, and charge the deposit when they sell that into the market. There's discussions ongoing with how they can do that in terms of scheme administrator, and they may choose to do that through that organisation.
Okay, and we have talked once or twice about retailers. Would you like to tell us then what you see as the biggest changes being for retailers on Scotland's islands?
So I think absolutely. I think that the biggest change is having to accept containers back through their stores and getting that would be the biggest change, that they'll be taking containers back to provide them to the scheme administrator. Obviously, for doing that, they get this retail handling fee, which compensates them for that role in the scheme.
So once the scheme is up and running, who will be making the operational decisions, the ones that aren't laid out in the regulations? So, for example, how frequent collections will be?
So we fully expect that producers will set up what's called a scheme administrator, which will operate on their behalf. They'll sit in the middle of the scheme, as we saw, and make these operational decisions. That's likely to be a mix of producers and retailers, those who have obligations within the regulations. So we're currently in discussions, or producers and retailers are working with us as part of working groups to think about how that organisation could be set up to deliver those obligations. So ultimately, it'll be a scheme administrator, likely to be a not-for-profit company with representation of those who are involved in delivering the scheme, and potentially individual organisations or trade bodies representing sectors.
Okay, thank you. So we have had quite a lot of questions today in advance about return points and about the practicalities of running a return point. So one question, for example, we've had is, how frequently will the empty bottles and cans be collected?
So ultimately, that's a decision for the scheme administrator to make. They will set up the logistics contract. They might do that in a number of different ways. They might use backhaul, so understanding that products are being delivered to a number of retailers at the moment. Are there opportunities to bring those containers back through that existing fleet? They might set up a separate logistics operation, or they might do a mix of the two. Ultimately, the logistics needs to work for the retailers who are part of the scheme, and there needs to be a flow of containers being brought back for sale onto the market.
Okay, and what about if people choose to buy drinks in supermarkets in town, but then they return them to smaller shops? What are the implications for storage for the smaller shops?
So it might be the case that some people choose to do that. What we tend to find is that people will take them back when they're doing their inverted commas big shop of the week. When retailers, they might take back more containers than they sell, depending on their location. And that's ultimately working with the scheme administrator to make sure there is the logistics set up to provide the regular collection that they will need.
Okay, now this is a question that probably won't surprise anyone. What impact might bad weather have on return points and collections? Something unfortunately we're all familiar with living in Scotland.
Yeah, so this is something that came up as part of the island engagement events. What happens to the containers that are collected manually and need to be taken back to a counting centre to be counted before the deposit can be paid back out to the retailer? The scheme administrator could look at different options there in terms of how they operate their cash flow. Ultimately, they do need to get the containers back into the scheme. And they might look at setting up different locations for counting centres. Ultimately, that's a decision for the scheme administrator.
Okie doke. Still on return points, do we have any indication about what sort of volumes of returns that retailers might be expecting?
Well, we're talking about 2 billion containers, give or take, being included within this scheme. So it's a huge number of containers across the scheme. The returns to individual retailers will vary, and retailers will know better than us how many containers they sell, and work with others to decide how many they're likely to get back through their physical return point. But yes, it's 2 billion containers in total, so it's a big number.
I mean, that's a lot of containers and presumably a lot of storage. Do you know if retailers will be supported in covering any costs of storage?
So as I mentioned, the retailers will get what's called a handling fee, and that looks to compensate for their role in facilitating the return of containers. And that needs to work alongside the logistics service, getting those containers back from retailers to the scheme for processing and onward sale.
Okay. Now you've talked a lot about retailers and the fact that all retailers will be included in this scheme, existing retailers. Will there be any new return points created specifically for deposit return?
Yeah, absolutely. There's opportunities for community trusts and similar bodies to act as return points to support the infrastructure of retailers. The scheme should be as easy to return a container as it is to buy one. We recognise that in some areas there'll be large areas without a shop, and it might be that a local community decides to step in and provide a return point to support the scheme administrator and ultimately help them deliver that 90% target. There's also opportunities for local organisations to set up as return points, and they might take back containers on behalf of people, and it could be seen as a charitable donation to their cause.
Okay, thank you. We've also had quite a lot of questions about hospitality, so I'll put a few questions on that issue to you now, Stuart. How do you think this will work for hotels and bars in particular? They produce a lot of cans and bottles. Do you think counting these is going to be a problem?
No, not at all. Currently, these premises are paying for a recycling collection to have that material taken away. Under this scheme, the scheme administrator will come and get those containers from them. They'll take them back to a counting centre and put them through counting centre and ultimately refund the deposit. Once it gets back to the counting centre, it's quite a quick process to count the containers through the machines, and that allows them to pay out the deposit back to the specific retailer or hospitality premise.
Okay, and how slick do you think the new system could be at processing large quantities of materials?
Well, I've mentioned it's going to be a scheme that's set up to take around about 2 billion containers. It needs to have the infrastructure behind it to operate that, and absolutely it will be set up to do that. We'll look at schemes elsewhere, understanding the infrastructure they have in place to maximise the efficiency of that scheme.
Right, okie doke. Well, at the top of this webinar, Stuart mentioned that the reason we're introducing this scheme in the first place is for the environmental benefits that we expect it to bring, and lots of you have asked questions about that. So the first one, has there been any discussion about reusing rather than recycling, because reuse can have greater environmental benefits?
Absolutely, reusing is always the better thing to do. We do currently have 2 billion single-use drinks containers being placed on the market in Scotland each year. We're recycling about half of those. There's a huge opportunity to get those containers back in for recycling and to make use of that material that goes into those products. So absolutely, reuse is the better option. But we do have a particular issue with single-use drinks containers at this moment, and this will get those back in for recycling, making better use of the resources.
Okay, now this next question is one we do get asked a lot. Where will the materials go once they've been collected? Where will they go to be recycled specifically?
So within Zero Waste Scotland, we have a number of work streams that are working on deposit return scheme. One of them is specifically on reprocessing infrastructure and attracting investment in Scotland to deal with that material here. The real opportunity from deposit return scheme comes from the quality of the material that it collects. So if we have, say, 20,000 tonnes of plastic PET, for example, that is a real incentive for companies to invest in Scotland to make use of that material here. What we see happen elsewhere in other deposit return schemes across Europe is PET processing setting up in very close proximity to the deposit return scheme to make use of that material. So it'll be sold onto the market, but we're absolutely hoping that material is within Scotland and we can get the economic benefit in Scotland.
Great, so kind of a double benefit then. This next one's more of a sort of consumer question. What condition should bottles be in when people bring them back?
So the bottles should be empty, first of all. You need to be able to read the barcode to check that it has been a scheme article. So that's the main thing, is you're able to read the barcode. You can have the cap on the bottle, it doesn't make a difference. But yeah, the machine needs to be able to read the barcode and show that it has had the deposit paid on it for the deposit to be paid back out.
Okay. So this is quite a nice question. This is from someone who says they run a Bag the Bruck scheme. And they're asking, could we end up claiming deposits back for bottles washed up on the coast? If so, might the local retailer end up paying out more deposit returns than their sales?
So we're aiming to get 90% plus of containers back into the deposit return scheme. So I would hope there are not containers washing up on the beaches that have been part of this scheme. If there are containers out there that have been littered for whatever reason, yeah, they can be returned to the scheme, as long as the barcode can be read, as I said previously. We've talked already about kind of peaks and troughs in stores getting more bottles back than they've maybe sold. Ultimately, they are recompensed for their role in facilitating the returns, and they'll get that deposit plus the handling fee back from the scheme administrator.
Good, thank you. Another sort of consumer-focused question. Because I want to protect the environment when I go to mainland Orkney, I have a car full of recycling. Most of my purchases are from the main supermarkets. How will those shops be expected to cope with me bringing over a month's worth of plastic back?
So the shops will set up to accept returns in very similar ways that they set up at the moment to have you through their shops. There are a number of different types of vending machines, from roughly the same footprint of a kind of canned vending machine up to a kind of facade with a number of containers sitting behind it. So there's lots of different options for retailers to set up their reverse vending machines, and ultimately they'll put in the number of machines that are required to take the returns that they'd expect to get from their consumers.
Okay. And another question on retailers, as you said, they'll be expected to display the deposit level separately from the price of the product. How will the labelling work in practice for retailers?
So the regulations say they need to display the deposit price separately. It doesn't say how that needs to be done. So there's different options. It could be on the shelf, kind of plus 20 pence. It could be that a small shop might just put up a poster saying it's 20 pence. It's ultimately for the retailer to decide how they want to meet that part of the regulation. It provides flexibility to different circumstances.
Okay. Another person's contacted us to say that they feel the current logistics facilities are hopelessly overstretched, and also that ferries have limited capacity. How will the collection agent be tendered out on a small island?
So, as I've said, there are a number of ways that the scheme administrator might choose to get containers back to the scheme, to a central point for onward sale. They might make use of backhaul opportunities. They might set up with separate logistics companies. We're engaging the ferry companies as part of our work to understand some of the challenges around that and how we can make best use of those facilities. I don't think we've seen any significant concerns from them on that point. We'll continue to engage with them. What I would say is, for most of the islands, not all of the islands, those containers are coming off the islands at the moment, whether it be through a recycling stream or whether it's going to landfill or energy from waste. So there's material coming off the islands at the moment that will be coming off in a different way. It's not that it's not coming off at the moment.
So not necessarily adding to the total bulk that's being transported then. Okay, this one's a more general question. So just because DRS works in other European countries, why have we based the modelling on this? And how do we know DRS will be effective in Scotland?
So we've gone around other deposit return schemes to see what works best elsewhere. But that's very much in mind bringing it back to Scotland's circumstances. So again, making sure that it's as easy to return a container as it is to buy one in Scotland. So all retailers are obligated, because we recognise we have quite a diverse number of retailers, quite spread out, and we need to maximise that accessibility for people. The deposit rate isn't to incentivise consumers to return their containers, and we think 20 pence is the appropriate level to incentivise that behaviour change in consumers. So we have looked to learn the best parts of other schemes, but certainly bringing that back to Scotland's particular circumstances.
Okay, we've also had a few questions, people slightly concerned about the potential for fraud. Can you maybe talk about what fraud prevention measures might be in place?
So I think this will be about people potentially buying containers south of the border and bringing them back into Scotland. There's nothing in the regulations that stipulates how producers need to mark their containers. Ultimately, that's a decision for producers, and we'd expect the scheme administrator to decide how they want to mark their containers to minimise fraud. What we would expect is that producers will change their labels and have separate stock keeping units for Scotland to effectively stop the ability for people to bring containers back from south of the border. So if you buy a product in Scotland, it will be clear it's part of the deposit return scheme. It is a decision for producers to decide how they want to do that, and the flexibility is within the regulations for them to decide that.
Right, okay, thank you for that, Stuart. Now, we've had, I'm delighted to say, quite a few questions coming in throughout the session. So I've got a few more for you, Stuart. You're not off the hook yet. So somebody asking for a wee bit more around community facilities like halls and schools and how they can get involved in this.
So absolutely, as I said, the scheme administrator might be looking for return points in different locations, and there's the opportunity in there to apply to the scheme administrator to be a return point. There's also opportunities for sports groups, for example, in a charitable way for donations to be made to them via the containers and for them to be returned to the scheme and for the local organisations to effectively take the deposit as their donation. So there are big opportunities here for other organisations to get involved in the scheme and ultimately maximise the returns to hit that 90% target.
Great. So if you're interested, basically watch this space and keep your eyes peeled for more. Okay, thank you. So this is a good question. What about containers, that predate the scheme? Will they still be accepted for recycling?
So they will still be accepted for recycling, but they're not part of the deposit return scheme. So the deposit return scheme will accept containers that have had the deposit paid out in them, not containers that haven't had the deposit paid. So there'll still be recycling collections, and we're working with local authorities on what they will look like going forward, but they will not be returned to the deposit return scheme when it starts up.
So basically put them either in your curbside or your household waste recycling facility.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there will be exemptions for small stores, according to the regs, if there is another return point nearby. Do you know yet how exemptions will be determined?
So the criteria for that are still being worked up. What the regulations allow for is for return points to come together and work with other retailers in the area. So if there are several retailers in a block of shops, for example, it might make more sense for just have one return point there rather than have multiple. The criteria are still being worked up, and we're testing some business forms this week, and discussions are ongoing on the criteria for that exemption.
Okay, so again, watch this space for more information on that. Okay, another question about transportation, and you did mention this has been a recurring theme throughout the islands events. How will goods be transported from small islands to collection centres?
So again, the scheme administrator will decide how they operate that collection service. It might be through backhauling of materials. They might set up a separate logistics contract utilising local businesses to bring that material back. We have a work stream which is starting to look at the logistics side of things at the moment within Zero Waste Scotland. Ultimately, it needs to work for all the retailers and all the return points. The obligation is in there, is in the regulations for the scheme administrator to get those containers back from all return points, regardless of where they're based geographically. So it's a decision for them to make as to how that works operationally, but it will happen.
Okay, thank you. Another consumer question. We do like to change tack and keep Stuart on his toes with these questions. How will people know if a container has a deposit against it? Will there be a barcode or a logo on the drinks container? And what are the labelling requirements for the scheme?
So as I've mentioned, the labelling within the regulations gives maximum flexibility to producers to decide how they want to label up their products. I would expect that it would have a separate barcode and potentially a logo of some description on it. That is a decision for the scheme administrator. We are in discussions with producers at the moment about how they want to minimise fraud, and ultimately it's a fraud prevention measure as well as informing consumers. So those two things go hand in hand, and those discussions are ongoing at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Another slight change of tack, going back to the issue of reverse vending machines. If you're a retailer or a return point, will there be an option to lease a reverse vending machine rather than buy one?
So it's almost a question for the providers of the machines as much as it is for ourselves. Absolutely, leasing is a great thing to do, has circular economy benefits. I would expect we would see providers offering a lease opportunity, and we certainly see it in other countries where they are active in the market. And I know there's a number of manufacturers who are obviously interested in this space at the moment, and obviously see it as an opportunity, a new scheme being set up, and they'll be looking at different ways that they can provide the machines for Scotland.
I mentioned earlier that we're looking for any comments as well as questions. So if, as Stuart was saying there might be an opportunity to get leasing. If that's something that you're interested in, is leasing an RVM, please do drop us an email to drsevents@zerowastescotland.org.uk, and that's obviously something that we can make known to the manufacturers as well, that there is an interest in leasing. Another environmental question. Now, this is one we've had before. This is a good question. Will transport from the DRS collections lead to more carbon emissions?
Okay, so no, it won't lead to more carbon emissions. The carbon benefit from recycling the material far outweighs the transport carbon emissions. So obviously the scheme will look to minimise its carbon impact across the piece. It will look at the types of vehicles it uses and minimising vehicle movements, etc. But ultimately there's this huge opportunity that I mentioned, kind of 160,000 tonnes of carbon per year from recycling this material, making better use of material that might be going to energy from waste or landfill at the moment. So that will far outweigh any differences in carbon movements.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. Other consumer question. If people return things they bought in the supermarket to my shop, and I'm guessing this has come from a small retailer, where will I store everything?
This is where the logistics setup that the scheme administrator makes needs to work for all the circumstances of retailers. So some might need very regular collections, some might have a weekly or a fortnightly collection. The logistics needs to be flexible to deal with those different scenarios. And as I said earlier, it works alongside the handling fee, which can help to compensate for handling material and storing the material if you need to store it for an amount of time.
Okay. We've had another question about hospitality, just in general, about how this will work for restaurant and bars. I know you spoke about this earlier, but if you'd like to maybe just give us a summary of how it will work for the hospitality sector.
Yeah, so there's the option for on-site and off-site consumption. So on-site would be a restaurant or a pub where you don't expect the containers to be leaving the premise Now, the containers have had the deposit paid through the supply chain. So when that premise has bought their beer or their cans, whatever it might be, they'll have paid the deposit on top of that. Because they don't expect the containers to leave the site, they don't need to charge the deposit. And because they're not charging the deposit, they don't need to act as a return point. So you wouldn't expect a member of the public to turn up with a bag of containers and return it to a restaurant. On the flip side, if you're operating a takeaway restaurant, for example, you are expecting those containers to leave the site. So you do need to charge the deposit, and you do need to offer the opportunity for consumers to bring that container back to your store to get the deposit back.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. I have to say these are great questions and they're still coming in, so thanks very much. I've got another one now, just turning to a slightly different aspect of the scheme. This is about implementation. So will implementation be phased? If so, will it focus on the urban population centres first and then move to more remote areas in time? Obviously, we wouldn't describe islands as remote, we would just describe them as a different geographical location. But what do you think? Do you think the scheme will be rolled out all at once or in urban areas first?
I would expect the scheme to be rolled out all at once. It's very challenging to kind of section off parts of the country. Materials and products flow in and out of different areas of Scotland and are moved around Scotland. So a deposit bearing container could obviously move around the country. So I'd expect to see the Scottish scheme rolled out as one when it comes to implementation.
Okay, thanks very much. If a small store can't afford to participate, are there any alternatives?
In terms of acting as a return point?
Well, the person who's asked the question doesn't say, but I would read that to mean, is there an exemption or is there another way they can discharge their responsibilities?
So there is the opportunity to work with other retailers close by. But what I would say, this shouldn't cost retailers money in terms of acting as a return point. The part they play in the scheme is compensated for through the retail handling fee, so they will get that money back, and they will get the deposit back from the scheme administrator, and they'll also get the handling fee back as well.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So will the scheme administrator work be tendered out? It seems like an opportunity for community groups to earn money, and it could be this question is about, could community groups get involved in the administration of the scheme?
So we'd expect the scheme administrator to be set up representing those who have obligations within the scheme. So the kind of producers, the retailers, the hospitality premises, ultimately they have regulatory obligations that they'll be discharging through the scheme administrator. They will be looking for ways to deliver this scheme in the most efficient way possible, and that might mean tendering out different parts of it, different parts of the country, and there's absolutely opportunities there for different organisations from different sectors to bid for that work. What I would say is that's probably a stage beyond where we are at the moment. We're talking about a scheme administrator being formed at the moment. That would be the next stages where the opportunities really become clear.
Yeah. So we're not quite there just yet. Okay, this is turning to looking at what happens abroad. So in other countries, rather than paying out a deposit in cash, some shops offer a voucher to be used in the store. Will this be the case in Scotland?
Yeah, so I'd expect a machine to maybe print out a voucher which says you've redeemed your 5 containers, you're due £1 back. And that can be used in the store, or you can take the money away from the store. We do see in schemes elsewhere that a large proportion of deposits that are redeemed, the money is then spent in the same shop as it is redeemed, but there is the option to get the cash back as well.
Okay, so there'll be different options there for consumers. Great. Okay, this one, the next one, slightly different tack again. There are a lot of unanswered questions and a lot relies on the scheme administrator, says this person. Who will be responsible for holding the scheme administrator to account?
So SEPA, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, will be the regulator of the scheme. Anybody who wants to act as a scheme administrator will be expected to effectively apply to Scottish Government for the right to be a scheme administrator of the Scottish Deposit Return Scheme. So there's two parts there. SEPA ultimately the regulator of the scheme, though, so making sure they hit the 90% target, for example.
Great. So we should be reassured then that there will be somebody will be keeping an eye on this. Okay, great. I think this is my final question actually for today. This is from somebody who owns a coffee shop. They say, we have a coffee shop and some people drink cans on site, but not always. They might also take it away. What do we do if they haven't paid deposit to us?
So if you're expecting cans to leave your site, effectively you're an off-site premise, so you'd be charging the deposit in that situation.
So basically, they do charge the deposit. That's the answer. Okay, that's brilliant. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions for just now, the pre-submitted questions and the live questions. So thank you very much to everybody who submitted one. There is still the opportunity to ask us questions. You can still hit the question button, or you can email us on drsevents@zerowastescotland.org.uk before Thursday of this week. If you have any questions or indeed comments on the scheme and how it relates to island communities, then please do drop us a line. Also, Stuart has given us a lot of information via a presentation today. Thank you for that, Stuart. And it's going to be available on our website after this. So that's depositreturn.scot. While you're on the website, we've also got an extensive frequently asked questions section if you're looking for any more information. And also we do issue a stakeholder e-newsletter, so you can sign up to that on the website if you would like to. So thank you again to everyone who's joined us today. It's great to have so many people with us, and thank you for all your questions. We've had a really fabulous range of questions and we've had a lot submitted, so I think that just shows the level of interest in this scheme. So thank you to everyone, and thank you once again to Stuart for all that information and for dealing with all those questions on the spot. Well done.